Welcome back to APUSH, AP U.S. History. We've been looking at the West. We looked at the Native Americans coming to an end of the settlement of the West, the frontier. Now we're going to turn our attention to miners and how they shaped the West. Um, there's going to be numerous gold and silver strikes in the West, and this is going to bring miners uh, to the West. Along with gold and silver were copper and lead, two valuable resources. Of course, miners coming to the West were seeking to get rich quick. Most of the early mining was placer mining, that is, extracting the gold from the creek bottoms, from the surface. Quartz mining was where you started digging into the ground and tunneling and mine shafts and so forth. The first big gold rush that brought people to the West was the gold rush of 1849. The gold was found in Sutter Mill in Northern California, and over 100,000 people came in a short period of time, within a year or so, and California will become a state very quickly after we defeat Mexico and acquire California, and it will become a state because of the Compromise of 1850. Other gold strikes were in Colorado, which is going to bring miners there, which is also going to create problems between Native Americans and the miners. Pikes Peak or bust, part of this gold discovery. One of the probably the richest silver strikes and gold strikes in America was a Comstock lode found in Nevada in Virginia City. Uh, Quickly taken over by a corporation, as were most mines in the West, and it becomes a corporate enterprise. Uh, as these big mines grow, they need heavy equipment, and the only way to get the heavy equipment to the mines is by railroad. So this is going to facilitate the building of railroads in the West. So prospectors, you can see here, looking for gold and silver primarily. You can see coal and iron deposits more so in the east, and you can understand why that became the hub of steel production in America. This is the Anaconda mine in Montana, at one time the largest silver or copper mine in the world. With mining came boom and bust, and uh, towns sprang up, and they quickly folded when the strikes panned out. This is a place called Kelso, California, outside of Barstow. If you get a chance to go to this old town, ghost town, for a nominal fee, you can take a tour. But tons of silver were taken out of that mine. In addition to miners coming and settlers settling the West, you have cattlemen and sheep herders coming and raising stock on the vast quantities of grassland in the West. Um, the cattle raising will help the growth of transcontinental railroads because cattle will be driven to the rail heads and then shipped back to the east for slaughter and consumption. A great deal of the cattle went to Chicago, and from there it was redistributed to the east to feed millions of people. Because of the open range, it was a good area to raise cattle. Essentially, the grass was free. It was owned by government entities, but you were free to graze your cattle on the government land. As herds grew in Texas, they're going to be driven to the railheads in Abilene, Dodge City, Ogalla, Nebraska, and these will be uh, terminals where large numbers of cattle are going to be processed and shipped. Eventually, barbed wire will be brought on by settlers to keep the cattle out, and this will end the cattle drives. This shows some of the railroads, the transcontinental railroads being built. There were primarily four: Burlington Northern in the Montana, North Dakota area, Minnesota to Washington. You had the Union Pacific and Central Pacific building the first transcontinental railroad. You had the Santa Fe, and then you had the Southern Pacific in the south. These showed some of the cattle trails that the drovers used to drive to the railheads. Joseph Glidden is the man who came up with the barbed wire, uh, little barbs on the strings of wire to keep the cattle from going through the fence. There were range wars between the sheep herders and cattlemen over who was going to control the rangeland, and there will be conflicts there, and people will be killed. Farmers. This is frontier settlements. Uh, you can see that the progression here: 1870 in green, the orange 1880s, and the burnt brown by 1990. And you have the Utah Territory, Arizona Territory, New Mexico Territory being some of the last areas to be settled, and also the Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. One of the reasons that people came west was because of the Homestead Act, which induced people to come, and they could acquire 160 acres if they lived on the land for 5 years, made some improvements, and paid a nominal fee of about $10. By 1865, a half a million families migrated to the west because of the lure of cheap land. Unfortunately, for most of these people who came west, a lot of the lands that they tried to homestead eventually ended up in the hands of large corporations. One of the main crops grown in the Great Plains was wheat because of the dry climate. Cattle was also raised and sheep, but wheat was a primary agricultural commodity in much of the Great Plains. Here you can see the Homestead Act and public lands. Railroads promoted people to come because they were given free land on either side of the tracks to build as the tracks. It was an incentive by the government, and so after they had acquired the land, they wanted to sell it to settlers. So they instituted a campaign to encourage people to come to the west. What is the message in this picture? Well, living on the Great Plains was a pretty tough life. You didn't have too many neighbors. It was a pretty tough life to negotiate. And a lot of these family farms went bust. The primary building material that they used was sod, that is grasslands. They would cut those into brick-like shapes and build their homes. Dirt floors and a few windows, wooden doors. Pretty tough life. This shows the annual rainfall, and you can see that much of the Great Plains is pretty dry. So it's more conducive to wheat growing. The Oklahoma land rush came in 1889. The U.S. government made about 2 million acres available in Oklahoma, and people flocked there to settle the land. By the end of the year, the state had 60,000 inhabitants, and eventually Oklahoma will become a state because of all the people rushing in to get the free land. The U.S. Census Bureau announced that for the first time in U.S. history in 1890, no longer a frontier line was discernible. Probably a term that you probably need to know is called the safety valve theory. It puts forth the supposition or the hypothesis that the West served as a safety valve for unemployed workers who moved to the West and farmed and became prosperous. In fact, that probably doesn't hold too much water. It's not exactly true. In most of the cases, immigrants, people coming in to the cities, were unable to afford to go to the West. Most of the land settled in the West were already people who were living there. They just moved a little further west. Why did people go to the West? Cheap land, wanting to have a home, the adventurous spirit. It took a pretty tough person to make it in the frontier. Cowboys certainly had, buckaroos had a role in taming the West. Frederick Remington captured the West in many of his paintings. Certainly, there were a large number of black cowboys who went to the West. Gunslingers, because of the wide open nature of the West, there weren't too many lawmen, and there were bandits, gunslingers, wanted people. Billy the Kid, James, or Jesse James. And with the lawless came some of the more famous lawmen, Bat Masterson, Wyatt Earp, fighting crime in the West. Some myths and legends of the West. This is a traditional view of the West: cowboys fighting Indians. This is a picture of Buffalo Bill Cody and the Wild West show, trying to reenact conflicts between the Indians and cowboys, soldiers, and so forth. Sitting Bull actually toured with a Western show for part of his career. Of course, there were some women that were legendary for their marksmanship and toughness: Annie Oakley and Calamity Jane. This shows some cowboys dealing with the weather, riding line, and making sure the fences were up to keep the cattle in. What were the long-term effects of the Western experience? Well, it destroyed the West in terms of buffalo, and because they will almost become extinct. A lot of the natural beauty is destroyed by mining interests and overgrazing of cattle, but there are a few places that have been set aside for posterity: Yellowstone National Park, Yosemite, and so forth, national parks. Here are some of the national parks that we have, and I encourage you to go visit one of them. One of the big conservationists at this time was John Muir, and the first conservationist president was Theodore Roosevelt. A Sierra Club is founded to protect our native lands. And we'll stop